Have you ever wondered how a single battle, a single decision, could reshape the entire course of human history? Tonight, as you settle in, I want to take you on a journey through time. Not the history that happened, but the history that could have been. Imagine a world where Rome never became an empire, where Latin never became the foundation of Romance languages, where Christianity might never have spread across Europe, where the entire Western world as we know it simply doesn't exist. This isn't science fiction. This is alternate history. And it all hinges on one civilization that came terrifyingly close to changing everything: Carthage. In our timeline, Rome won the Punic Wars and became the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. But what if things had gone differently? What if Hannibal Barca had made one different choice at the gates of Rome? What if Carthage's navy had secured just one more victory? What if the greatest what-if in ancient history had actually happened? Tonight, we're exploring a timeline where Carthage won the Punic Wars. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this single change would make our modern world completely unrecognizable. So get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive into one of history's most fascinating alternate realities. Before we can understand what would change, we need to understand what actually happened. And the real story of the Punic Wars is already stranger than fiction. Picture the Mediterranean in 264 BC. Two superpowers are rising, and they're on a collision course. On one side, you have Rome, an aggressive republic in Italy that's been steadily conquering its neighbors. On the other side, you have Carthage, a maritime empire based in North Africa in what's now Tunisia, that controls trade routes across the Mediterranean. These weren't just different nations, they were fundamentally different civilizations. Rome was a land power built on the backs of citizen soldiers and a republic that gave voice to its people, at least to some of them. Carthage was a naval empire, built on trade with an oligarchic government controlled by wealthy merchant families. The Carthaginians were Phoenicians, descendants of Semitic peoples from the Levant, while Rome was Italic and would become the foundation of Western European civilization. The First Punic War broke out in 264 BC over control of Sicily. Rome, despite having virtually no navy at the start of the war, managed to build one and eventually defeated Carthage after 23 years of brutal fighting. Carthage lost Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica and had to pay massive war reparations. But here's where it gets interesting. Carthage didn't collapse. Instead, they rebuilt. They expanded into Spain under the Barcid family, specifically under Hamilcar Barca and his son, the legendary Hannibal. The Second Punic War is where our story really focuses. In 218 BC, Hannibal did something that still boggles the mind today. He marched an army, complete with war elephants, from Spain, through Gaul, over the Alps, and into Italy. Historians still debate the exact route, but the achievement itself is undeniable. He lost many men and most of his elephants in the crossing, but he made it. And then, Hannibal proceeded to devastate Rome. At the Battle of Trevi, he crushed a Roman army. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed and destroyed another. And then came Cannae. The Battle of Cannae in 116 BC is still studied in military academies today. Hannibal, outnumbered by the Romans, executed a perfect double envelopment, surrounding and destroying a Roman army of potentially 80,000 men. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Some historians estimate that up to 20% of Roman adult males died in Hannibal's campaigns. For 15 years, Hannibal campaigned in Italy, winning battle after battle. Rome's allies began to defect. The city itself seemed on the verge of collapse. Hannibal was at the gates, victory seemed certain. But he never attacked Rome directly. Historians still debate why. Maybe his army was too worn down, maybe he lacked siege equipment, maybe he was waiting for more support from Carthage that never came. Whatever the reason, this decision would prove fatal. Rome, against all odds, refused to surrender. They adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding direct battle with Hannibal while gradually wearing down his army and retaking his allies. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Scipio took the war to Spain, conquering Carthage's holdings there. Finally, Scipio invaded North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled to defend his homeland. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Scipio defeated Hannibal, using the Carthaginians' own tactics against him. Carthage surrendered, was forced to give up its navy, pay crushing reparations, and never make war without Rome's permission. The Third Punic War was basically Rome finishing the job. From 149 to 146 BC, Rome besieged and destroyed Carthage, burning it to the ground. The famous legend about salting the earth is probably myth, but the destruction was real. Carthage was gone. Rome went on to become the Roman Empire, conquered the entire Mediterranean, spread Latin and Roman law, and laid the foundation for Western civilization as we know it. But what if that hadn't happened? What if at any several critical moments, things had gone differently? Let's create our alternate timeline. We need to choose a point of divergence, a moment where history takes a different turn. The most obvious moment is Hannibal's decision not to march on Rome after Cannae. In our timeline, Hannibal's cavalry commander, Hannibal, supposedly said to him, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use it." Historians debate whether this actually happened, but it captures the essence of the moment. In our alternate timeline, let's say Hannibal makes a different choice. After Cannae, with Rome in shock, with many of Rome's Italian allies defecting, Hannibal gathers his forces and marches on Rome itself. The city's not prepared for a siege. The psychological impact of seeing Hannibal's army at the gates, combined with the recent catastrophic losses, breaks Roman will to resist. But we need to be realistic. Rome wouldn't fall in a day, so let's construct this carefully. After Cannae, more of Rome's allies defect than in our timeline. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, joins Hannibal and opens its gates. Other cities follow. Rome's manpower advantage begins to evaporate. Crucially, in this timeline, Carthage sends more support. Perhaps the Carthaginian government, seeing Hannibal's success, commits more fully to the war. Ships arrive with supplies, money, and reinforcements, including siege equipment. Hannibal lays siege to Rome in 215 BC. The siege lasts 2 years. It's brutal. People starve. Disease spreads. The proud Roman Republic, which had never surrendered to a foreign enemy, faces its darkest hour. But here's the thing about Rome. Even in our timeline, they were incredibly stubborn. So in our alternate history, let's say Rome doesn't completely surrender. Instead, after 2 years of siege, exhaustion on both sides, and mediation by Greek city-states that fear either power becoming too dominant, a peace treaty is signed. The Treaty of Rome in 213 BC includes these terms. Rome recognizes Carthaginian supremacy in the Western Mediterranean. Rome loses all territories south of a line running through roughly central Italy. This includes Campania, Puglia, and other wealthy regions. Rome must pay war reparations to Carthage, though not as crushing as what Carthage paid in our timeline. Rome must limit his military and cannot make war against Carthage's allies. Rome essentially becomes a regional power in central and northern Italy, not the Mediterranean empire it became in our history. Carthage, meanwhile, emerges as the supreme power in the Western Mediterranean. They control North Africa, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and now effectively controls southern Italy through allied city-state. This is our point of divergence. Now let's trace the consequences through the centuries. The next few decades after the Treaty of Rome would see a Mediterranean world organized very differently from our own. Carthage would face the same question Rome faced in our timeline. What do you do when you've won? The Carthaginian system was based on trade and naval power, territorial conquest. They preferred to control trade routes and establish commercial relationships rather than directly governing vast territories. This means the Carthaginian Mediterranean would look very different from the Roman Empire. Southern Italy would probably not be directly ruled by Carthage. Instead, Carthage would establish a system of allied city-states, similar to what Rome had before, but with Carthage as the hegemon. Greek cities like Tarentum and Syracuse would maintain autonomy, but would be required to support Carthage militarily and give Carthage favorable trade terms. Spain would remain under Carthaginian control, but probably with less direct governance than Rome eventually imposed. The Barsic family might establish something like a hereditary governorship, ruling Spain as a semi-independent domain that pays tribute to Carthage. North Africa would see greater development than in our timeline. With more resources and confidence from their victory, Carthage would invest heavily in agriculture, cities, and infrastructure in their African territories. The hinterland beyond Carthage itself will become more urbanized and integrated into the Mediterranean economy. But what about Rome? This is crucial. Rome doesn't disappear in this timeline. The Roman Republic continues to exist, but it's contained, humiliated, and bitter. For a generation, Rome would be internally divided. Some Romans would advocate for accepting the new reality and making peace with Carthage. Others, especially the old aristocratic families who built their power in military conquest, would seethe with resentment and plan for revenge. Roman culture would become more inward-looking. The confident expansionist ideology that defined Rome in our timeline will be replaced with a more defensive, even paranoid worldview. Romans would see themselves as a besieged people, surrounded by enemies, their rightful destiny stolen by Carthage. This cultural trauma would shape Roman identity for centuries. In our timeline, Roman mythology emphasized martial virtue and destiny to rule. In this timeline, Roman mythology would emphasize endurance, suffering, and eventual restoration. Think of the Jewish experience after the destruction of the Second Temple, and you get a sense of how Roman identity might evolve. Now let's talk about what happens to the rest of the Mediterranean. Greece is crucial here. In our timeline, Rome conquered Greece in the 2nd century BC, ending the Hellenistic period and beginning the Greco-Roman synthesis that would define Western culture. In our Carthaginian timeline, Greece faces different pressures. The major Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire in the Near East, and Ptolemaic Egypt would continue their complex rivalries. Carthage, primarily interested in the Western Mediterranean, would probably not intervene heavily in the East, at least not initially. This means the Hellenistic kingdoms last longer. Alexander the Great's cultural legacy continues to evolve without Roman interference. Greek culture remains dominant in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it doesn't merge with Latin to create the Greco-Roman synthesis we know. Egypt under the Ptolemies is particularly interesting. In our timeline, Rome gradually became involved in Egyptic politics and eventually annexed Egypt in 30 BC after the death of Cleopatra. In our alternate timeline, Ptolemaic Egypt might remain independent much longer, or might fall to one of the other Hellenistic powers, or might even seek an alliance with Carthage to balance against threats from the east. Trade patterns would shift dramatically. In our timeline, Rome connected the Mediterranean through roads and a common legal system facilitating trade. In our alternate timeline, Carthage's naval power would make sea trade even more dominant. The famous Roman roads might never be built on the same scale, meaning overland trade remains slower or expensive. This has knock-on effects. Cities that thrived on Roman roads in our timeline might decline. Port cities would become even more important. The entire economic geography of the Mediterranean would be different. Languages would also evolve differently. Latin, contained to central and northern Italy, would remain a regional language rather than the lingua franca of the West. Punic, the Carthaginian language derived from Phoenician, might spread more widely, especially in merchant communities. Greek would remain dominant in the East, as in our timeline, but without Latin to eventually challenge and blend with it. Imagine a Mediterranean where common languages of trade are Punic and Greek, not Latin and Greek. This alone would change everything about later European culture. The cultural development of this alternate Mediterranean would be fascinating. Carthaginian art and architecture, which we know relatively little about because Rome destroyed so much, would flourish and influence surrounding regions. The aesthetic principles would be different from Roman classicism, perhaps incorporating more Near Eastern and African influences. Literature would develop in Punic rather than Latin in much of the Western Mediterranean. Epic poems, philosophical treatises, historical chronicles, all would be written in a language completely foreign to us. The great works that shaped Western literature in our timeline, works by Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, would never exist. Instead, we'd have Carthaginian classics we can't even imagine. Education would be organized differently. Without the Roman model of grammar schools teaching Latin rhetoric and literature, young people in the Western Mediterranean might learn in institutions based on Carthaginian merchant traditions, emphasizing practical mathematics, navigation, foreign languages for trade, and perhaps different philosophical schools. The concept of citizenship would evolve differently. Roman citizenship was a legal status with specific rights and duties eventually extended across the empire. Carthaginian approaches to identity and belonging were probably more fluid, based more on commercial relationships and less on strict legal categories. This could lead to more cosmopolitan identities in Mediterranean cities, or to more rigid divisions between merchant elites and others. Religious practices would also diverge from what we know. Roman religion, with its emphasis on state cults and household gods, shaped later European paganism and even influenced Christianity. Carthaginian religion, which centered on deities like Baal Hammon and Tanit, would spread differently. Mystery cults might be more or less common. Syncretism between different religious traditions might be more accepted or less accepted depending on Carthaginian cultural norm. The Hellenistic world deserves special attention because its fate would be so different in this timeline. Without Roman conquest, the great Hellenistic kingdoms might endure for centuries longer. The Seleucid Empire, which controlled much of the Near East and was gradually weakened by Roman interference in our timeline, might remain powerful. This could change the entire history of Mesopotamia, Persia, and the surrounding regions. The blend of Greek and Persian culture that characterized the Seleucids would continue to evolve, creating a distinct civilization. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, one of the most sophisticated states of the ancient world, would chart its own course without Roman domination. Alexandria would remain the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. It's a great library preserving and expanding Greek learning without Roman interference or later destruction. Macedonia might reconquer parts of Greece and reestablish something like Alexander's empire. Or Greek city-states might maintain their independence through complex alliances. The philosophical schools of Athens, the Oracle at Delphi, the Olympic Games, all would continue without Roman influence changing their character. This prolonged Hellenistic period would be a golden age of Greek culture, science, and philosophy. The achievements of scholars like Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and Euclid would be built upon by subsequent generations working in the same tradition, uninterrupted by Roman conquest and cultural shift. Mathematics and science might advance further in this environment. The Greeks had already made remarkable progress in geometry, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Without the Romans, who were more practical engineers than theoretical scientists, the Greek emphasis on abstract reasoning might lead to earlier breakthroughs in mathematics and physics. Now we come to one of the most profound changes in this alternate timeline: religion. In our world, Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, benefited from Roman roads and administration, was eventually adopted by Roman emperors, and became the dominant religion of Europe. But in a world where Rome is a secondary power and Carthage dominates the Mediterranean, what happens to Christianity? Christianity still emerges in Judea in the 1st century AD. Jesus is still born, still preaches, still is crucified by Roman authorities, assuming Judea's history follows a similar path. But how Christianity spreads after that would be radically different. Without a vast Roman Empire to spread through, early Christianity would face different challenges and opportunities. Carthaginian's empire is less centralized, more focused on coastal cities, more oriented toward trade than territorial control. Christian missionaries might find it easier to travel by sea, moving from port to port, but harder to penetrate inland regions that aren't as connected to Carthaginian infrastructure. Crucially, Carthage's religious tolerance, or lack thereof, would differ from Rome's. The Carthaginians worshipped a pantheon of deities, including Baal Hammon and Tanit. There are controversial ancient accounts of child sacrifice in Carthage, though modern archaeology suggests this might have been exaggerated by hostile Roman and Greek sources. Regardless, Carthaginian religion was quite different from Roman religion. Would Carthage be more tolerant of Christianity than Rome was? This is a fascinating question. Phoenician culture had a long history of religious syncretism, blending different traditions. They might be more accepting of new religions as long as they didn't threaten social order, or they might see the monotheistic exclusive claims of Christianity as dangerous to their multi-religious trading empire. Let's imagine Christianity spreads more slowly in this timeline. Without Roman infrastructure and eventual imperial adoption, it remains a smaller, more decentralized movement. Maybe it becomes one of several mystery religions competing for followers in Mediterranean cities, never achieving the dominance it had in our timeline. But here's where it gets really interesting. If Christianity doesn't dominate Europe, what does? Roman paganism might survive longer in Italy and the Western Mediterranean. Celtic religions might persist in what we call France and Britain, never being suppressed by Christian missionaries. Germanic paganism in northern Europe would certainly last longer without Christian Rome to push back against it. Or maybe other religions fill the vacuum. Judaism might spread more widely if there's no Christian competitor. The various mystery religions of the ancient world, like the worship of Mithras or Isis, might grow larger. Maybe entirely new religions emerge that we can't predict. And what about Islam? In our world, Islam emerged in Judea in the 7th century AD and spread rapidly across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. The Islamic conquests were successful partly because they faced a weakened Byzantine and Sasanian empires exhausted by decades of war. In our Carthaginian timeline, the political situation in the 7th century would be very different. There is no Roman Empire, no Byzantine Empire. Carthage might still be a major power or might have declined. The Sasanian Persian Empire might be stronger or weaker depending on how events played out over the centuries. The religious landscape would be different, potentially affecting how Islam emerges and spreads. Islam might spread more easily in a Mediterranean not unified under Christian Rome, or it might face stiffer resistance from a still powerful Carthage. Or the conditions that gave rise to Islam might be so different that it emerges in a completely different form, or doesn't emerge at all. Now let's talk about culture and learning. In our timeline, the Romans were great at engineering and law, but they preserved and transmitted Greek culture and learning. Medieval monks copied Greek and Roman texts, preserving them for future generations. The Renaissance was sparked partly by the rediscovery of classical texts. In our alternate timeline, without Rome playing this preservative role, what happens to Greek learning? The great libraries of Alexandria and Pergamum might last longer without Roman conquest, or they might be destroyed in different wars we can't predict. Greek philosophy, science, and literature might survive better, or worse, depending on how history unfolds. Carthaginian culture itself is somewhat mysterious to us because most of our sources are Roman, and Rome destroyed Carthage so thoroughly. But we know Carthaginians were sophisticated, literate people with their own literature and philosophy. In our alternate timeline, Punic culture would flourish and develop, potentially giving rise to philosophical and literary traditions we can barely imagine. Without Latin as the scholarly language of Europe, education would look totally different. There would be no Latin-based university system as developed in medieval Europe. Different languages, different texts, different intellectual traditions would shape learning. The preservation of knowledge would happen through different institutions. Perhaps Carthaginian merchant guilds would establish libraries and schools to train the next generation of traders and administrators. Perhaps religious institutions, whether pagan temples, Jewish synagogues, or other centers of worship, would become centers of learning. Perhaps wealthy families would endow academies similar to the philosophical schools of Athens. Whatever form it took, education in this alternate timeline would emphasize different values and different skills than in our history. The trivium and quadrivium of medieval education, based on Roman models, would be replaced by different curricula more suited to a maritime commercial civilization. Let's jump forward several centuries and imagine what the medieval period looks like in our Carthaginian timeline. This requires some serious speculation, but we can make educated guesses based on the changes we already established. First, there is no Roman Empire to fall in the 5th century AD. This is huge. Fall of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages is one of defining transitions in European history. Without it, European history follows a completely different path. What we call Western Europe, the lands of modern France, Germany, Britain, and Spain, would not be Romanized to the same extent. Celtic, Germanic, and Iberian cultures would develop more independently. There might be sophisticated civilizations in these regions, but they'd be based on indigenous traditions rather than Roman models. Carthaginian culture itself might have gone through its own cycles of rise and decline. No empire lasts forever. By our medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 AD in our calendar, Carthage might have fragmented, then conquered by rivals, or evolved into something unrecognizable. But the cultural and linguistic legacy would remain, similar to how Roman influence persisted long after Rome fell. The Mediterranean might be divided among several competing powers, successor states to Carthage in North Africa, independent kingdoms in Spain, surviving Greek states in the east, and perhaps new powers arising from regions that were underdeveloped in antiquity. Trade would likely be even more important in this timeline than it was in ours. Without Roman roads and with Carthaginian naval traditions, maritime commerce would be the bloodline of Mediterranean civilization. Cities would be more important than rural areas. Merchant families would have even more power than they did in our medieval period. This might lead to something resembling the Italian city-states of the Renaissance, but much burlier and on a larger scale. Imagine Venice, Genoa, and Florence, but in the year 700 instead of 1300, and spread across the entire Mediterranean. These merchant republics would compete with each other, trade, sometimes cooperate, sometimes fight, creating a complex web of alliances and rivalries. Innovation in navigation, finance, and commerce would be driven by this competition. Speaking of innovation, let's talk about technology. In our timeline, the medieval period saw relatively slow technological progress in Europe, though this Dark Ages concept is often exaggerated. The Roman Empire had been more advanced in many ways, and it took centuries to recover that knowledge. In our alternate timeline, without Rome to rise and fall, technological development might follow a different path. Carthaginian engineering, based on different principles than Roman engineering, would create a different technological baseline. Maritime technology would advance faster with more emphasis on naval power. Agricultural techniques would differ based on North African and Mediterranean practices rather than Roman ones. Stirrup, the heavy plow, and three-field system, all the agricultural innovations that transformed medieval Europe might arrive earlier or later, or in different forms. This affects population growth, urbanization, everything. Militarily, the feudal system that dominated medieval Europe emerged partly from the collapse of Roman authority and the need for local defense against invaders. In our timeline, that system might never develop in the same way. Without feudalism, you don't get chivalry, knights, castles in the same form, and the entire social and cultural complex that came with medieval European warfare. Instead, military organization might remain closer to ancient models, with professional armies and navies funded by wealthy city-states. Mercenary companies might be even more common and more powerful. The entire concept of nobility and aristocracy would be different. Now, what about the territories Rome conquered in our timeline? Britain, Gaul, the Balkans, Anatolia, these regions would all develop very differently without Roman rule. Britain, never Romanized, might see Celtic kingdoms develop along different lines. The Anglo-Saxon invasions might still happen, but they'd be conquering Celtic kingdoms rather than the remnants of Roman Britain. English culture, language, and identity would be completely different. The English language itself might not exist or might be very different without Latin influence. Gaul, modern France, would not become Romanized and Romance-speaking. Celtic cultures might persist, or Germanic tribes might conquer earlier, creating a very different linguistic and cultural landscape. The Franks might still emerge as a powerful kingdom, but their culture would be more purely Germanic without the Roman Christian overlay. The eastern half of the empire is interesting. These regions were heavily influenced by both Rome and the later Byzantine Empire. Without Roman conquest, they might remain more Greek, or might be conquered by powers from the east, or might develop independent kingdoms. The complexity here is immense. Eastern Europe, which Rome never conquered even in our timeline, might be more or less advanced depending on trade patterns and cultural influence from the Mediterranean. The Slavic peoples might expand and organize earlier or later. The entire history of Russia and Eastern Europe could be completely different. Spain is a particularly interesting case. In our timeline, Rome conquered Iberia and imposed Latin, which evolved into Spanish and Portuguese. Then Islamic forces conquered most of Spain in the 8th century, creating Al-Andalus. In our alternate timeline, Spain might remain under Carthaginian influence or might be independent, changing how Islamic expansion proceeds there. We need to circle back to Islam because its role in this alternate history is so uncertain yet so important. In our timeline, Islam emerged in Arabia in the 7th century and rapidly spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. The Islamic Golden Age preserved much classical learning, made major advances in science and mathematics, and profoundly shaped world history. In our Carthaginian timeline, several scenarios are possible. Islam still emerges in Arabia with a similar message and trajectory. The Prophet Muhammad still unifies the Arabian tribes and begins the expansion. But instead of conquering a weakened Byzantine Empire and Sasanian Persia, Islamic armies face a different political landscape. If Carthage is still a major power in North Africa in the 7th century, the Islamic expansion would face serious resistance there. Instead of quickly conquering Egypt and North Africa as they did in our timeline, early Islamic forces might have to fight prolonged wars against Carthaginian successor states. This could slow or stop the expansion into the Western Mediterranean. Alternatively, if Carthage had already declined by this point, North Africa might be fragmented among several competing powers, making Islamic conquest easier in some ways, harder in others. The campaigns would look different, but the outcome might be similar. Spain is another key region. In our timeline, Muslims conquered most of Iberia in the early 8th century, creating Al-Andalus. In our alternate timeline, Spain might be under Carthaginian control, divided among several kingdoms, or conquered by Germanic peoples from the north. The Islamic conquest of Spain might be easier, harder, or impossible depending on these conditions. The conditions that gave rise to Islam might be different enough that it emerges in a very different form, or doesn't emerge at all. The religious, social, and political circumstances of 7th century Arabia might be so changed by the butterfly effects of Carthage winning the Punic Wars that history is unrecognizable by this point. And this is actually quite plausible. 600 years is a long time for butterfly effects to compound. The Arabian Peninsula's contact with the Roman and Persian empires shaped early Islamic thought and expansion. With different empires or no empires in these regions, the entire context changes. However, I lean toward thinking Islam or something like it still emerges. The social and economic conditions in Arabia, the monotheistic influences from Judaism and Christianity, the tribal structures, many of these factors might be relatively independent of Mediterranean politics. But the subsequent spread and development of Islam would certainly be different. What if the religious landscape is so different that Islam faces entirely different competitors? Without Christianity dominating Europe, without the Roman Christian tradition, the religious marketplace of ideas in the 7th century would be totally different. Islam might spread into regions that were Christian in our timeline, but are now pagan or follow other religions, changing how Islam itself develops. One fascinating possibility: without Christian Europe, Islamic civilization might expand more easily into the Mediterranean region, but might face different challenges in the East. Balance of Islamic versus non-Islamic territories could be completely different, affecting everything from Islamic theology to cultural practices to political structures. The Islamic Golden Age might happen earlier, later, or in a different form. The preservation of Greek philosophy and science by Islamic scholars, which was so crucial in our timeline, not happen if Greek learning survived differently, or if Islamic expansion took different routes. In this alternate timeline, the Mediterranean might be far more religiously diverse than it was in our history. Without Christianity's spread and later dominance, without Islam's rapid expansion, the ancient world's religious diversity might persist much longer. Imagine a 10th century Mediterranean where major cities host temples to Greek gods, Carthaginian deities, Jewish synagogues, emerging Christian churches, and perhaps mosques, all coexisting in various degrees of harmony or tension. This pluralism might create a more tolerant society, or might lead to constant religious conflict. History shows both patterns are possible. The intellectual implications would be profound. Religious diversity often drives philosophical innovation, as different traditions debate and learn from each other. Athens, Alexandria, and Baghdad were all centers of learning partly because they brought together people of different backgrounds and beliefs. In our alternate timeline, perhaps North African cities under Carthaginian cultural influence would become the great intellectual centers, synthesizing Punic, Greek, Jewish, and other traditions into new philosophical and scientific movements. Or perhaps religious conflict would be worse without Christianity's eventual unification of Europe, or Islam's creation of a unified Islamic world. Perhaps constant warfare between competing religious and ethnic groups would make the Mediterranean more chaotic and less prosperous than in our timeline. Now we come to one of the most dramatic differences. The European exploration, colonization, and eventual domination of the globe
probably never happens, at least not in the same way. In our timeline, European powers, starting with Portugal and Spain in the 15th century, began exploring the oceans, discovering the Americas, rounding Africa, and eventually creating global empires. This was driven by a combination of factors: technological advances in navigation and shipbuilding, economic motivations including desire for Asian trade goods, religious fervor to spread Christianity, and political competition among European monarchies. In our alternate timeline, almost all of these factors are different. Let's break it down. European advances in navigation like the caravel and the carrot, the astrolabe and better charts were built on a foundation that included Roman engineering, Islamic science, and indigenous European innovations. In our alternate timeline, the technological base is different. Carthaginian naval traditions might lead to different ship designs. Scientific knowledge might be preserved and advanced differently. The trigger for the age of exploration might come centuries earlier, or centuries later, or never come at all in the same form. The desire to reach Asian markets by sea, avoiding the overland routes controlled by Islamic powers, drove much exploration in our timeline. In the alternate timeline, trade routes might be different. If Mediterranean powers maintained stronger trade connections with Asia, or if the political situation allowed overland trade to flourish, the economic motivation for oceanic exploration might be weaker. The desire to spread Christianity was a major motivation for Spanish and Portuguese exploration. In our alternate timeline, without a dominant Christian Europe, this motivation largely disappears. Other religions might drive expansion, or religious motivation might be less important than pure economic and political factors. The competition among European monarchies drove much of the colonial expansion. In the alternate timeline, the political organization of Europe is completely different. Without the Roman tradition of centralized empire, without the Catholic Church unifying much of Europe, without feudalism giving way to absolute monarchies, European kingdoms might be smaller, less organized, and less capable of mounting expensive overseas expeditions. So does anyone discover America in this timeline? The Americas are still there, sitting across the Atlantic, and eventually someone's going to sail west and find them. But who, when, and what happens next could be very different. One possibility, Carthaginian or North African powers, with their strong naval traditions, might explore the Atlantic earlier than Europeans did in our timeline. Phoenician sailors in our history may have circumnavigated Africa. In our alternate timeline, with a stronger Carthage, they might venture further into the Atlantic, perhaps reaching the Canary Islands and even reaching the Americas. If this happens in, say, the 8th or 9th century AD, centuries earlier than Columbus, the entire colonization process would be different. The Americas would have more time to develop, or might face earlier epidemics from Old World diseases. Carthaginian colonization might be more focused on trade outposts, rather than the settler colonialism that characterized European expansion. Another possibility, Chinese exploration reaches the Americas first. In our timeline, the Chinese admiral Zheng He led massive naval expeditions in the early 14th century, before the voyages were stopped. In our alternate timeline, with different political pressures and decisions, Chinese exploration might continue and expand, potentially reaching the Americas from the west. Or perhaps American civilizations themselves, like the Aztec, Maya, or Inca, develop sailing technology and explore outward. Without the specific sequence of events that led to European conquest in the early 15th century, American civilizations might have more time to advance technologically. But let's consider the most radical possibility. Maybe large-scale oceanic exploration and colonization never happens on the same scale. Maybe the world remains more regionally divided, with powerful civilizations in the Mediterranean, in East Asia, in India, and in the Americas, all developing independently with limited contact. This would mean no Columbian exchange, the transfer of plant, animals, diseases, and people between the old and new world. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, chocolate, all of which originated in the Americas, might never reach Europe and Asia. Horses, cattle, wheat, and many old world diseases might never reach the Americas. The demographic and agricultural transformations this caused in our world would never happen. The genocide and cultural destruction of Native American peoples, one of the darkest chapters in human history, might be avoided, or might happen differently. The Atlantic slave trade might never occur, sparing millions of Africans from that horror, but also meaning the African diaspora that shaped so much of modern culture would never exist. The entire global economy would be different. The plantation systems of the Americas, the Industrial Revolution in Europe, partly fueled by colonial resources, the rise of capitalism intertwined with colonialism, all of this might never happen or might happen in unrecognizable forms. Let's talk about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, two transformative periods in human history that might never occur in our alternate timeline or might happen in completely different ways. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, when figures like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton transformed our understanding of the natural world built on specific foundations. It required the preservation of Greek and Roman learning through the Middle Ages, the influence of Islamic science, the development of universities, the invention of the printing press, in a cultural milieu that valued empirical observation and mathematical analysis. In our Carthaginian timeline, some of these elements would exist in different forms, others might be missing entirely. Universities as we know them emerged from Christian institutions in medieval Europe. Without a Christian Europe, centers of learning would be organized differently. They might be more secular, more focused on practical knowledge for trade and navigation, or they might be controlled by different religious or philosophical traditions. Printing press, invented in our timeline by Gutenberg in the 15th century, was a response to specific needs and opportunities in European society. In an alternate timeline, movable type printing might be invented earlier or later in Europe or in Asia, or information technology might develop along entirely different lines. Without the specific sequence of events in European history, without the Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts, without the Protestant Reformation challenging established authority, the cultural moment that enabled the scientific revolution might never arrive, or it might arrive centuries earlier or later, driven by different needs and different thinkers. Imagine science developing primarily in a Carthaginian or North African context, driven by maritime needs like navigation, trade. Such a science might prioritize different questions, use different methods, and reach different conclusions than the European science of our timeline. Or imagine science developing primarily in Islamic civilization, which had its own scientific golden age in our timeline. Without competition from Christian Europe, Islamic science might advance further and faster. Or imagine Chinese science, already quite advanced in our timeline, becoming globally dominant without European colonialism disrupting Asian societies. The Enlightenment of the 18th century, with its emphasis on reason, individual rights, and political reform, also built on specific European conditions. It was a response to religious wars, absolute monarchies, and the emerging middle class. All of these conditions would be different in our alternate timeline. Perhaps an Enlightenment-like movement still occurs, based on different philosophical traditions. Ancient Greek philosophy, Carthaginian pragmatism, Eastern philosophies, all might contribute to new ways of thinking about human society and government. Or perhaps the specific constellation of ideas we call the Enlightenment, including modern concepts of human rights and democracy, never emerges at all. This is sobering to consider. Many of the values we consider universal, such as individual freedom, equality, and democratic governments, emerged from specific historical contexts. In a radically different timeline, humans might organize society according to completely different principles, not necessarily worse, but certainly different in ways we find hard to imagine. Let's push forward to what would be the modern era in our timeline, roughly 1800 to the present, and imagine what our Carthaginian alternate history looks like now. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century and transformed human civilization, might never happen in the same way. The Industrial Revolution depended on specific conditions: available coal deposits, a capitalist economy, colonial resources and markets, scientific knowledge, and cultural factors that encouraged innovation and entrepreneurship. In our alternate timeline, these conditions might not align in the same place at the same time. Perhaps industrialization happens earlier or later in North Africa rather than Europe, or in China, or in a completely different form. Steam power might be invented, or humanity might harness energy through different means altogether. Without European industrial dominance and colonialism, the power balance of the 19th and 20th centuries would be unrecognizable. There would be no British Empire, no French Empire, no Spanish Empire in their familiar forms. The scramble for Africa, which carved up the continent among European powers in our timeline, might never happen. African societies might develop independently, might be stronger or weaker, but certainly different. The world wars, which define the 20th century in our timeline, probably wouldn't happen at all, at least not in the same form. The First World War emerged from specific tensions among European powers, colonial competition, and alliance systems. The Second World War grew directly from the aftermath of the First World War and the rise of fascism in Europe. Without this specific European history, these conflicts would not occur. This doesn't mean there wouldn't be any wars. Human beings conflict over resources, ideology, and power in any timeline, but the wars would involve different powers, fighting for different issues with different technologies and strategies. There might be a great global conflict in the 20th century of this alternate timeline, but it would be utterly different from our worldly wars. The United States, as we know it, probably doesn't exist. European colonization of the Americas drove the creation of the USA. Without that colonization, North America might host indigenous empires, might be colonized by different powers, or might remain divided among many smaller nations. The global hegemon of the late 20th and early 21st centuries in our timeline would simply not exist. This means no American-led post-war order, no Cold War between the USSR as we knew it, no American popular culture dominating the globe, no Hollywood, no Silicon Valley, no American dream. The entire cultural and political landscape of our current world would be absent. Technology in the modern era would be fascinating to speculate about. Would we have computers? Probably yes, because the mathematics and physics underlying computation are universal. But they might be developed in different countries based on different programming languages, serving different purposes. The internet as a global network might exist, but its culture and content would be totally different. Would we have gone to the moon? Space exploration in our timeline was driven largely by Cold War competition between the USSR and USA. Without those powers and that competition, space exploration might happen later, earlier, or not at all. Or perhaps entirely different nations race to reach space motivated by different goals. Nuclear weapons might still be invented because the physics is universal, but who possesses them and how they're used would be different. The nuclear standoff that shaped our late 20th century wouldn't happen in the same way. Perhaps nuclear war is more likely in this timeline without the specific deterrent systems that evolved in ours, or perhaps it's less likely with different powers and different relationships. Environmental issues would be different too. The Industrial Revolution and subsequent economic development caused massive environmental damage in our timeline. In an alternate timeline with different development patterns, environmental destruction might be worse or better. Perhaps civilizations that developed from different cultural traditions would have more sustainable relationships with nature. Or perhaps the drive to exploit resources is universal, and the outcome is similar regardless of which cultures dominate. Let's talk about what daily life might be like in our alternate present. What languages would people speak? What would they eat? What entertainment would they enjoy? Language is perhaps the obvious difference. Without the Roman Empire, Latin never spread widely, and the Romance languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, they simply don't exist in the forms we know. Millions of people in our world speak Romance languages. In the alternate timeline, they speak completely different languages. Punic and its descendants might be major languages in the Mediterranean and beyond. Imagine a language family derived from Phoenician, spoken by hundreds of millions of people with its own rich literature, films, music, and internet content. This language would sound completely foreign to our ears, using different sounds, grammar, and vocabulary than any European language we know. Celtic languages might be far more widespread if they weren't displaced by Latin and then by English, French, and Spanish. Irish, Welsh, Bret, and extinct Celtic languages might have evolved into a major language family, spoken across Western Europe. Or Germanic languages might have spread further without Roman influence to push back. Greek would probably still be important in the Eastern Mediterranean as it was so culturally dominant regardless of Roman influence. but it would have evolved differently without contact with Latin that shaped its development in our timeline. In Asia, languages like Chinese, Sanskrit, Arabic, and others might be more or less widespread depending on how history unfolded there. Arabic, in particular, would be very different if Islam spread in different ways. The Americas, if contacted later or not at all by Old World powers, would have indigenous languages still spoken by millions. Nahuatl, Quechua, Maya languages, and hundreds of others might be thriving literary and spoken languages. Instead of being marginalized and nearly destroyed as they were in our timeline, they might be dominant languages of powerful, independent nations. Culturally, imagine a world where the Mediterranean culture isn't based on the Greco-Roman tradition, but on a Carthage.
Culturally, imagine a world where Mediterranean culture isn't based on the Greco-Roman tradition, but on a Carthaginian Greek synthesis. Art, architecture, literature, music, all would follow different aesthetic principles. Without Roman monuments and Renaissance revivals of classical architecture, cities would look completely different. Food culture would be transformed. The Roman Empire spread certain foods and cooking techniques across Europe. Mediterranean diet, as we know it, has Roman influences. In an alternate timeline, North African and Phoenician culinary traditions might be far more influential. Ingredients would have spread differently. The entire global cuisine might be unrecognizable. Music would develop along different lines. Western classical music emerged from specific European traditions, including church music. Without that tradition, you don't get Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and all that followed. Other musical traditions would dominate, perhaps based on different scales, rhythms, and instruments. Popular entertainment would be different. Sports like soccer originated in Britain, baseball in America, basketball in America. These global sports might not exist. Instead, different games and sports from different cultures might dominate. Perhaps Mediterranean ball games, Asian martial arts, or games we can't even imagine become global phenomena. Film and television, if they exist in similar forms, would tell different stories. Without European and American culture dominating, movies and shows would draw from completely different mythologies, histories, and cultural values. The heroes, plots, and themes would seem strange to us. Religion in the modern era would be utterly different. Christianity might be a minor religion or might not exist at all. Islam might be larger or smaller. Ancient pagan religions might have survived and evolved. Entirely new religions might have emerged. The entire religious landscape of this alternate present might include major faiths we've never heard of, followed by billions of people. Now, let's consider something deeper. How would human values and philosophy be different in this alternate timeline? Many of the concepts we consider fundamental to modern ethics and politics emerged from specific traditions: individual rights, equality before the law, freedom of conscience. These ideas have roots in Christianity, the Enlightenment, and specific European political struggles. In an alternate time, these concepts might never develop or might develop in different forms. Carthaginian political thought, as far as we can reconstruct it, emphasized merchant oligarchy and practical governments. The Carthaginian government was controlled by wealthy families and merchant guilds, not by the citizen assemblies that Rome, at least theoretically, valued. If this tradition had become globally influential, modern politics might be far more openly plutocratic, with wealth more directly translating to political power. Or perhaps the opposite. Perhaps the example of Carthaginian merchant oligarchy would inspire reactions against it, leading to more egalitarian movements. Without the specific history of European monarchy, feudalism, and eventual democracy, political thought might develop along entirely different lines. Greek philosophy would still influence the world, probably even more so without Roman mediation. But Greek thought is diverse, including Stoicism, Epicureanism, Platonism, and many other schools. Which of these became dominant would shape values in fundamental ways. A world where Epicurean emphasis on pleasure became the foundation of ethics would be very different from a world based on Stoic emphasis on virtue and duty. Eastern philosophies might be more influential globally if they weren't crowded out by Western expansion. Confucian emphasis on social harmony and respect for hierarchy, Buddhist emphasis on compassion and detachment, Hindu philosophical complexity all might shape a global ethics in this alternate timeline. Perhaps most intriguingly, entirely new philosophical movements might emerge from the specific conditions of this alternate history. Imagine philosophical traditions we can't even conceive of because they depend on historical experiences and cultural contexts that don't exist in our timeline. So here we are at the end of our journey through this alternate timeline. We've watched Carthage defeat Rome, dominate the Mediterranean, and set in motion a chain of events that makes our modern world unrecognizable. We've seen how languages would be different, how religions would evolve along different paths, how entire continents might develop independently of European influence. We've imagined different superpowers, different technologies, different values and philosophies shaping human civilization. What can we learn from this thought experiment? First, it highlights just how contingent history is. The Roman victory in the Punic Wars wasn't inevitable. Hannibal came close, terrifyingly close to destroying Rome. Few decisions had gone differently. If reinforcements had arrived, if Hannibal had marched on Rome, the entire trajectory of human history would have shifted. Second, it reveals how interconnected historical events are. Change one thing in 200 BC, and you change everything it follows. Languages, religions, technologies, values, all are linked in complex chains of cause and effect. The butterfly effect isn't just a metaphor, it's a fundamental aspect of how history works. Third, it challenges our assumptions about progress and inevitability. We often think of our modern world with its technology, values, and institutions as the natural endpoint of historical development. But this alternate timeline shows that very different worlds are possible. Democracy, human rights, scientific advancement, these aren't inevitable outcomes. They emerged from specific historical circumstances and could have been different or absent entirely. Fourth, it reminds us that our own history, the actual history we live in, is remarkable. The fact that Rome won, that Christianity spread, that Europe industrialized and colonized, that America became a superpower, this specific sequence of events led to the world we know. That world has massive problems, of course. Inequality, war, environmental destruction, injustice, all these plague our reality. But it's our reality shaped by thousands of years of specific choices and events. So finally, this thought experiment invites us to hold our own cultural assumptions more lightly. Many things we consider universal, natural, or inevitable are actually specific to our historical path. Different histories could lead to different values, different forms of social organization, different ways of being human. This doesn't mean all ways are equally good. We can still make moral judgments, but it does mean we should be humble about claiming our way is the only way. Carthage's defeat was one of the most consequential events in human history, even though most people don't think about it. The civilization that could have reshaped the world was destroyed so thoroughly that we mostly know about it from the writings of its Roman enemies. In our timeline, Roman victory led eventually to Christianity, to Romance languages, to European nation-states, colonialism and industrialization, to the modern world in all its complexity. In the alternate timeline we've explored, Carthaginian victory led somewhere completely different, to a world we can barely imagine even with our best efforts at speculation. The truth is, history could have gone in countless directions. Everyday decisions, large and small, shape the future in ways we can't predict. The battle Hannibal won or lost in 216 BC mattered immensely, but so do decisions made today by leaders and ordinary people alike. We're all part of the great, chaotic, unpredictable flow of history. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this. What if? What if one thing had been different? What if one decision had gone another way? What if you yourself make a different choice tomorrow? How might the future change? History isn't just something that happened in the past, it's happening right now. And the choices we make today might matter just as much as whether Carthage won or lost 2,000 years ago. Sleep well and dream of all the worlds that might have been and all the worlds that might yet be.